Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Elemental Energy. I have the absolute pleasure of bringing on one of my favorite individuals that I get to work with. We're going to talk about hydrogen. This is the part 2 continuation of hydrogen, the US market today. I really want everybody to take away from this that we're delivering this right now in a daily basis of trying to make hydrogen a more sustainable option. And Gary Martin and I are going to cover that. So I'm going to introduce Gary really quickly. Gary, it's about time that I introduce you to the nickname that you have when Max and I talk about you, and it's the GOH. Do you want to know what the GOH stands for, Gary?
Yeah, I'm curious. I was going through my mind. What could it stand for?
The godfather of hydrogen. We look
There
at
you
you,
go.
Gary, and I feel so lucky to be able to be learning from you and to see the exposure that you are already implementing at such a large scale at Worley. And I am just amazed at how much knowledge and how much you're willing to share as well. So that's my introduction of you, but I would love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself further, please.
Yeah, Gary Martin, as I guess is pointed out by the nickname. I have a few decades of experience in engineering. Originally started out in power, and then I did some water work and then got involved in fuels, and eventually I transitioned into the green fuels that we're doing now, hydrogen being one of those.
Gary, I think that we could even go further. I've heard some amazing stories shared about your energy journey when it comes down to being in mining carts and being in production scenes. I mean, you've seen it all. Like you have seen such a large span of the energy progression.
Yeah, that's what happens when you get old, Marcia, you see. So, yeah, it comes up every once in a while that right out of college, I was working on clean coal projects. So this is when we all thought that the goal was to make coal combustion cleaner. And now, a few decades later, we're talking about CO2 as a pollutant that we would have never thought about 40 years ago, and ways to tackle that, hydrogen being one of them.
Hey, it's okay. At least we know we can admit when we're wrong, right?
Yeah, it's just the thing that we have to think about is where will we be when you're my age? What will we be working on at that point?
I am very excited to see that, mainly for my girls, Gary, because I think that what we are doing, specifically you and I in this energy transformation space, is going to help them see a more sustainable future.
Well, maybe the introduction, it might sound like this was planned, but I guess a lot of years ago, 25 years or so, I was driving and my daughter was quite young at the time, asked what I did. And this is when I was still in the water business. And I described that to her, how I was doing things to combat water pollution. And she says, "Oh, Daddy, that means every day is Earth Day for you." So think about that as you go forward, that some of us can celebrate Earth Day every day based on what we do.
You have the pleasure of living into the mountains, as do I. And I couldn't imagine going outside and suffering pollution, air pollution particularly, and water pollution from tailings and just we're very lucky to live where we are and to be doing what we're doing, in my opinion.
Yeah. Some of those have the tailings from mining operations and all, though, that we're still cleaning up, right?
Right outside of Silverton, but that's a different story for a different day, isn't it?
Okay.
So, Gary, I brought you on to talk about hydrogen, obviously, but I really want to talk about starting with the opportunities. Obviously, it's a huge push to decarbonize the energy industry. Energy storage for renewables is another one. And then sector integration. I mean, it's used across so many different sectors like power generation, transportation, industrial. But what do you see as the most important application that we need to remain focused on
With hydrogen or in general?
with hydrogen?
Well, I guess I'll start answering that by few people think these days that hydrogen's the answer to everything. You know, there was a time not very long ago that it seemed like there was a little bit of a battle between different solutions for decarbonizing, and people wanted to say that whether it was hydrogen or electrification was the solution to decarbonization. Most everybody now agrees that we need to use all of those tools for decarbonization. Hydrogen's one of them. It has its place. You know, certainly if we're going to make hydrogen from renewable energy, it probably doesn't make sense to use that renewable energy and convert it to hydrogen when maybe electrification is a better and simpler solution. So hydrogen has its place when you need to fuel a molecule instead of an electron, right? Lots of places we can use hydrogen in some transportation applications, but most people now are focused on using it for hard to abate areas like steel production, but also hydrogen is used when you're trying to export energy to different places, maybe as hydrogen itself, or maybe as a hydrogen carrier or with a hydrogen carrier like ammonia.
So that's actually hydrogen and transportation is one of the biggest foreseeable issues that I've come into this market. I'm trying to study hydrogen as much as I can, but transportation, because it's so volatile, what's going on with the transportation side? I have this idea I want to run past you and what I'm thinking, but what is going on with the transporting of hydrogen? How can we make it safer?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that last part. When you were talking about transportation, I thought you were talking about using hydrogen for transportation, either in light vehicles or heavy vehicles or something. I think what you're asking about right now is how do we transport hydrogen from one place to another? And one of those answers would be to try not to. You know, I mean, we make a lot of hydrogen right now, right, Marcia? We make it and use it in refining operations and to make fertilizer. But it's usually made at the place that it's going to be used at, which is the idea behind hydrogen hubs, that the US government's going to fund some of. So hydrogen is not easy, or maybe not easy to store or transport inexpensively. I mean, we know how to store hydrogen, we know how to transport hydrogen, but to do it cheaply is an issue. There are some hydrogen pipelines, so we know how to transport it, but I think you can imagine the cost if we were replacing or modifying all the natural gas pipelines in the country to hydrogen, storing it. We have a choice of gaseous or to liquefy it, both of those require energy and there's a cost. So we want to try and eliminate as much hydrogen storage and transport as we can. And there's different opinions, I guess, whether when we do have to transport and store it, we should do it in the gaseous mode or the liquid form, or if we convert it to something else that is easier to transport and store. Ammonia is one choice. A lot of discussion about e-methanol as other choices. And there's other technologies where the hydrogen actually be absorbed on another molecule that makes it easier to handle. Is that
Yeah.
answering the question or am I off base again?
No, that answered it perfectly. I think the concept of what is it called? Monochemical attraction, where they're taking it and trying to powder it with boron nitrate. That's a very interesting concept. What do you think about that?
I don't know very much about that one. There's quite a few of them out there, and probably someday we'll look back and say, what were we so worried about? This is obvious and easy and inexpensive. So you and I are more involved in hydrogen production for people, but there's whole other organizations, universities looking at other aspects of hydrogen. And I think my first comment is maybe not to try and force fit it into everything. If we have a solution, maybe that is the right solution, but we need to keep looking, right?
Right. And you started to touch on it a little bit as far as you mentioned hydrogen is produced where it's typically utilized. That's one of my favorite applications for green hydrogen is the thought of being able to place these electrolyzer facilities and these hydrogen hubs closer to places to where they're not as complex as SMR and ATR to form blue hydrogen. There you can apply them to more places and to more applications, right?
I'm not sure that's right. I'm listening, but maybe if you were to go back to thinking about a steel mill converting to a new way to make steel, I'm not sure that there's room to put your renewable energy close to where you're going to put the steel mill. There's other aspects to the steel, like the ore and everything. So it you have to look at the total picture, right? As to whether you can actually back to your green hydrogen example. I mean, sometimes it's going to be easier to put your renewable someplace and then build a transmission line to where you're making the hydrogen. That has costs associated with it and other logistical problems. Sometimes it's going to be better to put your hydrogen production close to your renewables and transport that hydrogen. But I don't think it's always going to be easier to do green hydrogen than blue hydrogen, or always that you can eliminate transportation or storage of hydrogen.
That's what I needed to hear because when you think about trying to put a hydrogen in onto some of these larger facilities, like I'm starting to go down the trail of bespoke design for SMRs and ATRs and kind of repeatable module design package for green hydrogen. They look very different. I look at blue and green hydrogen as completely different beast. It's the same molecule, but they are very different in how we go about producing them. So I look at green hydrogen as more of a simplified way of getting hydrogen versus SMR, ATR, maybe just because I don't understand the processes fully behind it. But is that kind of safe to say that green hydrogen and electrolyzer production is a bit more simple as far as design goes versus the other? Enlighten me.
I don't think so, but I think you said something key. You have been working with green hydrogen and electrolyzers, so you're probably more familiar with it. but a lot of people that have worked with traditional hydrogen production using an SMR, to them, it probably seems more straightforward to go that direction. I'm just one that thinks that there's a no one solution, right? I mean, that's what we were talking about, hydrogen versus electrification. There's going to be different solutions that are going to work out better in different applications. What I would say is that most of the blue hydrogen solutions are producing much bigger volume of hydrogen than the green hydrogen for what we think of as a normal plant size today. Okay. If I'm if I'm right, one ATR and associated carbon capture and all might make as much hydrogen as 2 gigawatts worth of electrolyzer capacity for green hydrogen. So just keep
That's
that in mind as you're thinking through this.
that's substantial. Like that's
Mm.
and then when it comes down to natural gas facilities versus electrolyzer lifespans, that's something else I kind of want to look into because I feel like the natural gas facility would have a little more longevity. Am I wrong?
I'm not sure that I'm the one to give an opinion on that, but I will say that, I mean, you're really onto something, you know, whether blue or green is the right solution. Also, is what country you're in, what your resources are. You know, you and I are both in the US. We have this huge network of natural gas pipelines that go all around the country, and we're a natural gas producer. So any opinion you and I have could be a lot different in a country that doesn't have natural gas distribution or has to import the natural gas. So again, just back to you need to look at every situation and then find the right solution for that situation.
That is a very good perspective because here in the United States, we do have an abundance of resources, natural gas being one of them, which is why blue hydrogen is being seen as a larger push, in my opinion, here in the market in the United States. But I also really am proud to continue to challenge with green hydrogen production and trying to make it more economically viable. Because let's talk about hydrogen as a molecule really quickly. Who cares if it's blue, pink, orange, turquoise, white hydrogen coming from natural resources, which I just learned about that one? It's still the same molecule. Nobody wants to pay 17 different prices for a molecule if it's the same molecule, right? People will tend to buy something a little bit more, I don't want to say cheaper, a little bit more cost effective. They'll choose for that lower price versus the higher price. So levelize or pulling green hydrogen to be a little more cost comparable to that of blue hydrogen is what we are trying to do in the United States right now, in my opinion, through policies, through government support, through trying to come up with designs where we could design one, build many. But what is your opinion on getting green hydrogen to be competitive with blue hydrogen?
And so probably I don't even want to talk about green and blue. Okay. So what I was thinking of when you were speaking, chemically, you're right. The molecule, the hydrogen molecule is the same. But thinking of it a different way, they're not the same. And that's why we talk about carbon intensity. Now, if we were only worried about the molecule, we could get hydrogen from gasifying coal, right? But that would probably release a lot of CO2 unless we were capturing that. So I think where everybody's at right now is looking at the total life cycle cost in terms of carbon emission for different hydrogen molecules. And so in that sense, they're not the same molecule. If I mean, here's an example. If you produced what you're calling green hydrogen, but we'll call hydrogen using electrolyzer, and you hooked it up to the grid in the US, then maybe that hydrogen you produce actually has a lifetime or life cycle carbon emission that's almost the same as if we produced it from natural gas and didn't capture any CO2. Okay. Because the grid in the US still has a lot of coal fired boilers making the electricity. So ultimately, yes, we want to make green hydrogen from renewable energy, but it's not as simple as just hooking the electrolyzers up to the grid, because you have to look at the CO2 that might be produced with the electric generation. It's the same thing with what people would call blue hydrogen. What methane leakage might you have further up in the chain from a well site that leaks methane or during the gas processing? So this is just one of the advances people have made, is looking at the total CO2 emissions for the hydrogen. And I think that might be where people will pay different amounts for, is that if you could certify the hydrogen as having this kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. But, that's still a discussion going on.
Gary, you sound like you have a bit of aversion to the color spectrums, like me calling it blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. Can you explain why you don't like those terms?
Well, people are because there's so many of them, right? And even some of them that you were, I mean, there's a general definition of green and blue, but they're not very specific. So if you said blue was from a fossil fuel, it's what fossil fuel, how much of the carbon dioxide was captured. Green is the same way. I mean, some people might say it's only green if it's generated from renewable energy. Some might somehow call it green if it's just produced from electricity. So everybody, that's probably a strong statement. Most people in the industry are just getting away from it and saying that carbon intensity is a more granular and specific way to measure it. So you're seeing those numbers out measured in terms of kilograms of CO2 produced per kilogram of hydrogen that you get. And the farther back in the value chain you go to measure that, will drive us all to making the right decision. We don't want to spend all this money, right? And then end up producing as many pollutants as we were trying to get rid of. I mean, that's a little bit like I started the conversation with clean coal. We were all shooting for a goal. We just didn't realize that the goal we were shooting for was complete. In those days, we were trying to reduce SO2 and NOx emissions. And so we were trying to capture the sulfur and reduce nitrogen going into the atmosphere. We didn't worry about CO2. Now we recognize CO2 has consequences, and we're trying to reduce those, but it can't be just localized, right? We got to look at the full picture.
I'm glad to hear you say they're getting more granular and how they want to represent the molecule, because even since I began this low carbon energy journey like 2.5 years ago, the color spectrum has gotten bigger and more broad. Like, I think you would get a kick out of Google searching the spectrum of hydrogen now. There's like a full rainbow, Gary. It's impressive. So it's nice to know that they're getting a little more granular and displaying how the molecule is produced. Gary, is there anything that you want to cover? Like, the whole point of elemental energy is to help bridge the mindset of conventional energy producers in our oil and gas industry with this new technology, and how to approach it with eagerness and an open mind to support it. Is there any advice that you can give? You've been in the conventional side. So, how can we help enlighten our people and get them excited about getting into the hydrogen industry?
One thing that, as you were talking, that came to mind when we talk about hydrogen is quite versatile, right? And we can use that hydrogen to make other fuels that look the same as we use today. We mentioned e-methanol, which is really methanol just made in a greener way. We can take that methanol and make gasoline. We can go use hydrogen and we can make aviation fuel. And that's something we need to look at for the right solution also, because it could be nice to use hydrogen for planes, okay, but then you have to buy a new fleet of planes, right? So it could be that the right solution is to convert that hydrogen into a fuel that looks like what we use now, but that new fuel emits less carbon than the conventional way of making that fuel. So again, I think you and I look at a very small part of the hydrogen value chain is how to produce it for our customers, how to build plants for our customers. But there's other people that are looking at how to use it, and it's equally important. It's a very complex thing, and I just think we need to look at that whole spectrum and make sure we're making the right decision. And there's a lot of really bright people out there looking at that to steer policies the right direction.
Gary, I want to thank you for continuing to challenge me. And I want to thank you for continuing to challenge how we are taking care of our customers in this space, because you are having a huge impact right now on the way that the United States and the market is handling both blue and green hydrogen. So, I'm going to close this off and just say thank you for taking the time to come onto Elemental Energy. And thank you for doing what you're doing, because it's a really important role that we are listening to our customers, developing solutions for them, and helping achieve lowest cost of hydrogen for some of these very big project ideas that our customers are having. So, as always, everybody stay happy, stay safe. And Gary, anything else you want to say to close us out?
No, but I'll think of something brilliant right after we end the recording, I'm sure.
The GOH, of course you will, Gary.
Yeah. Thanks, Marcia.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you, Gary. Thank you all so much for listening today. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe so you're notified every time a podcast is released. Find Elemental Energy on Facebook and connect with me, Marcia Leonard, on LinkedIn. But lastly, and most importantly, share this podcast with your family and your friends, especially if you are in the energy industry and you're having an influence on the path of decarbonization. I'm on this journey figuring things out, and I want you guys to come along. So, the closer I can get to you and the more I can connect with you, the better this show will be and become.